Well, hello and welcome to Polity Matters. My name is Ben Ratliff, and I'm joined as always by Jared Nelson and Scott Edberg. And if you are listening from the previous episode, you know that Steve Tipton is still with us because we're still in the middle of BCO Chapter 31. We have worked our way through the first four sections, and as I have written on my whiteboard in my office, I don't know who said it, clarity is the best style when it comes to preaching, and I think we can ascribe the same here. We're just going to be clear. Here we go into 31-5. An injured party shall not become a prosecutor of personal offenses without having tried the means of reconciliation of reclaiming the offender required by Christ. Moreover, if thy brother shall trespass against thee, go and tell him his fault between thee and him alone. If he shall hear thee, thou hast gained thy brother. But if he will not hear thee, then take with thee one or two more, that in the mouth of two or three witnesses every word may be established. Matthew 18:15 and 16. A church court, however, may judicially investigate personal offenses as if general when the interest of religion seemed to demand it. So also, those to whom private offenses are known cannot become prosecutors without having previously endeavored to remove the scandal by private means. So we're in this chapter on the parties in cases of process. Maybe one of you guys wants to get us into 31-5, start pulling it apart, and kind of give us a sense of where we are in this discussion.
Sure. So this is looking at primarily who can be a prosecutor, and it's going to continue in a paragraph 6 at least, and discussing the idea of prosecutors being established, chosen, or volunteering for the process of determining guilt or innocence in a trial. And so if you think back earlier about the chapter on offenses, there are personal offenses, there are general offenses, there are private offenses, there are public offenses. And so the first piece of 31-5 is describing the absolute responsibility of those who believe they have been offended personally by some sin, by an offender, that there is the responsibility of going to that individual per Matthew 18. So that establishes that requirement. And then I'm going to skip over the sort of first sentence of that third little subparagraph there and go to the last sentence, which talks about private offenses. You have to also try to remove the scandal by private means. And so if it is personal, then you go through Matthew 18. If it is private, then although it doesn't make direct reference back to Matthew 18, it seems that would be the proper process, that you don't want to make a private sin general, and you don't want to make you want to make a personal sin general, you don't want to make a private sin public if there is a possibility of addressing that offense through the means that Jesus has given us in Matthew 18.
And so there's two exceptions there, right? Just to kind of bridge us through. So the two exceptions would be if it's a private thing and attempts have failed, you can make it public by bringing it. And if it's a case that is personal, you can make it general by bringing it. If those attempts have failed in Matthew 18. Is that my understanding?
Well, I think you're, at least in my understanding, I would say you're very, very close. That by their nature, all trials are public.
Right.
But personal doesn't become general just because you go to trial, right? Personal remains personal because, and again, I think this is the difference between maybe principle and practice a lot in the PCA, that my understanding of the way the BCO is written, and sorry, Jared, I'm going to pick on you a minute. If I believe that Jared is offended against me personally and privately, I'm to go to him, try to get him to see his offense. If I fail in that, or he fails to see, then I take witnesses with me, okay. But then if it fails there, that my responsibility is actually to go to the court that has original jurisdiction over Jared and in fact lay down a charge. Right, I'm to make out a charge, and that if I want that charge to go forward, I should be willing and maybe even required by the court to be the voluntary prosecutor in that matter. Rather, what usually happens though is somebody will send to a presbytery a report concerning Jared's Christian character and want them to do an investigation and then them to prosecute it while I sit on the back row. Maybe I'm a witness, but I don't actually have to do anything. And I don't think that's really the way that the BCO is intending that to happen. That personal offenses, you need to address them personally all the way throughout the process by being a voluntary prosecutor. Now, again, the great difficulty in that is that our Lord also requires two witnesses, which is a different chapter. So if Jared sins against me personally and it was just the two of us, it's going to be really hard to demonstrate that in a trial. But I'll let somebody else discuss evidence issues later. But that it remains that personal idea. It doesn't become general unless we are looking at the one sentence I omitted. But you're right about the second half of that, that all of these things, if they are private, become public through process. Personal offenses, again, there's sort of a personal and private seem to go together much better, whereas general and public seem to go together much better. But I suppose that there's different combinations of those that you could describe.
So I'm looking at it, and your clarification is good. The line that is there is that a court may investigate a private offense as if general when the interests of religion seem to demand it, which is something different. I wonder, Scott, if you have any thoughts on that, since you're here and present.
I'll be present this whole episode.
Able to comment for a moment.
I'll be here this whole episode, even if you don't hear from me again. I was curious, in the current movement within some groups in the PCA, it seems that there's a general desire to make all, at least when dealing with teaching elders, all private offenses immediately public, even at the point of during and after trial. When we think about public and private and what is known to the public, what sort of discretion should we have when dealing with pastors? The general movement seems to be whenever pastors investigated, all of that should be public for the sake of transparency. Are there times when that shouldn't be the case? And what are some of those times, I guess?
Well, I guess what I would say, I mean, I understand, I've seen instances of what you're talking about, so I know how a lot of presbyteries tend to handle this. If I were in that presbytery, I don't know that anybody would listen to me, but my argument would be that a personal or a private offense does not become public by an individual going on social media and telling everybody about it, right? It's the nature of the offense, not what that individual has done afterwards. Mm-hmm. So if a person goes on social media and starts telling everybody how horrible, Jared Nelson is, we're just going to keep picking on poor Jared until he talks. Well, that doesn't make the offense public per se. It makes the, maybe it makes the sin of slander and gossip public, but that's a different issue, right? That's not the original offense. And so, obviously, I mean, great care has to be taken because of the nature of that spreading of information on social media. Now it is more generally known, but I think that the difference between personal and general is in one sense more fundamental than even public or private. Mm-hmm. That in one sense, I would say public or private is going to change how you communicate the outcome, right? Because if there's a private sin, then you need to communicate the outcome of that privately, unless there is great need to communicate that more broadly. let's say somebody's deposed because of that private sin, obviously that has to be communicated. But if possible, you should keep private matters private as far as you can. But if that personal offense has become public through any means, whether, someone's putting it out on social media, well, then it's not so much that all aspects of the trial need to go into a press release or something, but that certainly once the outcome has been decided, I think then that information could be shared more publicly. Whether in either way, right? I mean, in one sense, somebody's going to be vindicated. Either the accuser's vindicated that they were right, or the accused is vindicated that he wasn't wrong or whatever. So I think that issue is different. I think there's another trend that I've seen, which is this idea that power differentials kind of destroys the need even to do Matthew 18, so that if I sin personally against Jared, I'll flip it on you, brother. If I sin personally against Jared, well, we're both teaching elders, that's different. But if I sin against, a member of my congregation who's not a deacon or an elder, then by virtue of that power differential, they are not required to come to me per Matthew 18. And I find that an interesting sophistry, perhaps, but I don't find there any basis for that in Scripture, the Confession, or the BCO. But that's a slightly different topic. So, what do you think, Jared?
He's not.
Yeah, I mean,
here.
if we're just airing our kind of grievances on this sort of a topic, I actually made a habit of blocking people that I see that will share things that are not like. If you're reacting to somebody's public article, that's one thing. But if you're reacting to, hey, so did you hear so-and-so was accused of this by this person and it hasn't been adjudicated, it hasn't been taken care of by any court whatsoever, I just have started blocking rumor mongers and gossip. It's not becoming of our church process. It's not what's intended by these categories.
No, I agree. Well, can I ask one other, before we get to the personal as general, because I do think that's an interesting conversation. We might be in 31.5 all episodes.
Please no.
Sorry. But I know, Jared and I, when we were in the same presbytery together, we had an individual that had a very interesting take on Matthew 18. So maybe the other two guys, curious your opinion, the two or three witnesses, or the one or two witnesses that you take with you in the second step of Matthew 18, what do you guys think their purpose is in Matthew 18? What is their role?
You're giving me a gut interpretation here. I would, if there are 2 to 3 witnesses, I would assume that they are 2 or 3 or 1 or 2 other people who have witnessed that sin and can testify to the offense. Was that right?
Please grade Scott's answer.
Can you grade my answer, Steve? You're my teacher.
Ben,
here.
what do you think? Yeah, do you agree or?
I missed part of the question. I got to be honest.
Wow. Wow.
Yep. Hello.
He's not even listening at this
Best
point.
hosts ever.
Yeah, no, that's okay. Well, we can also just take all this out too, but, the individual I was thinking about, Jared remembers perhaps, took very dogmatically that it was Scott's position. I've always understood it as 1 or 2 witnesses that come to witness the fact that you are addressing the individual. I think the language of, and no offense, Scott, I know I did ambush you, so I'm not trying to suggest that
you set me up for this. You set me up to embarrass me. This is like in seminary when the professor intentionally wants you to answer incorrectly.
Yeah. Well, some people have, I think it's different. I think some people have dealt with this, and so they've thought about it more. Other people maybe haven't really dealt with it much, so they, and that's fine. But I think the idea that there is this sin that is between you and somebody else alone, i.e. personal, that when you go to them and they won't listen, that the way to demonstrate that you did Matthew 18 is you go with some witnesses that will say, yes, Steve talked to Jared, Jared refused. Now, I mean, they certainly can try to get that individual to listen or to consider or to think, but I don't think they're necessarily witnesses to the event. They are people that are there to help that person come to an understanding of their sin. So, but Ben, please feel free to cut all that out if you want.
No, it's a good point to make. I appreciate it.
But I think, so the other, real quick, the other piece there that is quite interesting to me is that, church court is given this permission, so to speak, to judicially and judiciously investigate personal offenses as if general when the interest of religion seemed to demand it. And it is, on the one hand, I'm not entirely sure what that, well, I'm not entirely sure what that means. Does it mean then that a court could say, you have no requirement to go and do Matthew 18 because we're just going to treat it as general, which would seem to completely gut the original sentence and the quote from Scripture? Or is it more about how they're going to prosecute the case and how they're going to conduct the trial, more as if it were a general offense rather than as a personal offense?
I have to think some of it may be, if this is touching on, say, somebody who's an officer or going to become an officer, if it's touching on their qualifications for office, it really does touch on, how they're going to be serving the church, even if it is a private matter between two people. And so then it kind of raises the stakes there. Or something where it's private, but it starts to become, well, is this a pattern? Is this something that he's representing the church and Christ this way? So I have to think that it's something along those lines.
Well, the only other thing I would say is, I mean, I do think that if a court is going to do that, and they believe that the interest of religion demand it, that, in my opinion, it would be, rather important for the court to give reasons why that is, right? I mean, in one sense, that should be a reviewable act, whether, on appeal or even by complaint, because you are taking away, you're saying this was a personal offense, but we're going to treat it as though it's not personal and treat it though it is as it is general. That's a fairly major step. And if you're going to do that, obviously our BCO allows you to do that, but I think you need to be clear as to why, rather than what it often seems to happen is it's just treated as, as a given that the court is going to treat it like general rather than private, or personal rather. So anyway.
Okay. 31.6. I didn't think I was going to get to say it, but there it is. 31.6. When the offense is general, the case may be conducted either by any person appearing as prosecutor or by a prosecutor appointed by the court. So is this as straightforward as it seems? I mean, Scott, you're going to leave soon. You're not leaving, but you're going to be really quiet soon.
I'll be quiet for a while.
I'd like to hear from you before you just go silent.
I don't think there's much really to add. That it describes the general, who will be the prosecutor in a case, whether it be any person appearing. That seems to be rather broad, or by someone appointed by the court, which would be somewhat more narrow.
Well, I think, someone can lay out a charge in either a personal or a general offense. And so anyone that appears as a prosecutor, to my mind, in one sense, is a person who's making out a charge and bringing it to the court. But if there is no such person, for instance, a 31-2 style investigation that results in a strong presumption of guilt, and no one, quote unquote, volunteers for that, then you have to appoint somebody. You can't say, well, we couldn't go to trial because no one wanted to be the prosecutor. That doesn't seem allowable under the BCO. So, yeah.
I'm sure Steve will correct me, but it seems to me that 31.6 is meant to be following 31.5, not just because of the numbers lining up, but because 31.5 is about personal offenses which require an attempt at reconciliation, whereas general offenses don't require a reconciliation attempt necessarily, and so you just move on to prosecution in one of these two ways.
Right.
Is that? I
Yeah.
mean, just these next to each other is the way I've always kind of
Well,
considered
and
them.
even
So,
7 carries that over to the next stage. So yeah.
which is after 6, right?
Yeah. Well, I always
This is
love
like
that
Sesame
when I'm
Street
preaching.
over here.
Yeah. No. When I'm preaching, I love that where it's like, verse 6, immediately explains verse 5, and it's like, you don't need to go to seminary to know that 6 follows 5. But anyway,
Except when there's a verse omitted, just very rarely, people are like, "Where's verse 16?" You're like, "It's not there. It's gone."
like Scott Edberg, it just slipped out,
Just
slipped away.
Well, here, 31:7, when the prosecution is instituted by the court, the previous steps required by our Lord in the case of personal offenses are not necessary. There are many cases, however, in which it will promote the interests of religion to send a committee to converse in a private manner with the offender and endeavor to bring him to a sense of his guilt before instituting actual process. So, obviously, I got ahead of myself and started talking about this at 31:6, but maybe this is a good place. Have you guys seen it work out like this before? So you don't have to follow the Matthew 18 back up in 31:5, but there are going to be situations where you may want to send a committee to discuss the matter. Have you all seen this in practice, or any other comments here?
I've certainly seen it tried. I don't know that it's,
Yeah.
successful. That may be
Sure.
a different question. Although I guess
I think that's good.
unfair, because I know I actually, now I think about it, there's been a couple of instances that I know about where someone, this happened and the individual actually came back with 38-1 as his own accuser, basically, and was brought to a sense of his guilt and wanted to confess. So I say it's never worked, but now that I think about it, yeah, actually it has in a few instances. So.
Yeah, and this has when prosecution is instituted, but we can probably all think that you have some sort of ministerial care committee that tries to do this before there's prosecution that's instituted. But this also gives you the opportunity to say, hey, is there a way to get this resolved before we have to have a called meeting?
Yeah.
We've had it happen before where we've started prosecution and have, in our continued interactions with the individual, they have gotten to a point where they've shown repentance or come as their own accuser, and so we suspend, the action we took and proceed in a different way. So it's interesting to me that this comes more or less as a suggestion. There are many cases in which it will promote the interest of religion to send a committee. They're not telling us what to do. It's just, hey, you want to be aware of this wise possibility in the situations that you don't have to seek reconciliation, but you still might want to try to press towards that as much as you can.
Well, but also remember that phrase, the interest of religion, was invoked so that the court could take a personal offense and treat it as general. And so even though you don't have to, and I do wish perhaps this was the other way around, in the sense where it was strongly advocating doing this, and the not doing would be the exception rather than what I've seen to become the rule. That that if you're going to do this, you need to, if they are personal offenses, you at least need to give that individual the opportunity outside of a trial to recognize what he's done and admit that and to seek reconciliation. On the one hand, it might potentially, right? I mean, it might even prevent court cases or, more cases that we have to deal with. But as it
seems like a difficult thread to put through that needle, because as the accused, on the one hand, there's a sense of, am I providing more evidence by the more I talk? Sometimes it seems that the more restrained approach would be, if you're thinking about trial, not to overspeak. And a committee meeting with a guy can put his foot in his mouth, whether rightly so or on accident. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, but I also think it depends on the nature of it too. And that's, even obviously there's all of this stuff fits together, but you think about even when you get to processes against teaching elders, one of the things is that they're not to be screened in the sense that they are prevented from being prosecuted, but at the same time, they, given their public nature, they also should not be constantly the subject of really petty, small, um, ultimately, in one sense, I mean, they're still offenses, but they're minor things that people want to bring up against them, and then to go through this process and try to make them general and try to get somebody else to prosecute or whatever else. And you know, I've seen this, personally, and I've seen it vicariously through other teaching elders that usually what tends to happen is, I mean, if you are able to go back to that offense, whatever it was, and you kind of evaluate it and investigate it on its own, often, not always, but often they are relatively minor things that have been allowed to fester over years, decades sometimes, and they become just such a huge aspect in people's hearts and minds, and so they want to push forward and press forward with these trials and things. And I know we're kind of getting a little bit far afield of all of this, but I think that that's where trying at least to go and do some reconciliation between people and help them and assist them can be helpful to the peace and the purity and the unity of the church. That's theoretically, right? I mean, what we're after. It's not guilty verdicts and flashy social media posts talking about how horrible somebody is, or vindication or whatever. So anyway.
Well, yeah, that kind of segues right into the next section because it deals with that in terms of accusations that you take seriously and those you don't.
Yeah.
5, 6, 7, 31:8. Great caution ought to be exercised in receiving accusations from any person who is known to indulge a malignant spirit towards the accused, who is not of good character, who is himself under censure or process, who is deeply interested in any respect in the conviction of the accused, or who is known to be litigious, rash, or highly imprudent.
Yeah, this is the courts of the church are not for personal vendettas or grudges, or for somebody that it's just been charged with something and say, oh yeah, well, I remember this and I'm going to charge you with that since you're the prosecutor, and I'm going to charge you with that because you let it go, because you voted to let it, be tried. So, this is a good reminder that this is not an arena for all your personal grudges, and there's a certain point which you say, if this guy has flooding the court with all these accusations, maybe it's not us, maybe it's him.
Well, and I also think that what's good about this is that none of those things necessarily, right, are automatic, rejection of something. Because, just because I have a malignant spirit towards something, well, I shouldn't, but just because I does not mean that there was not some real offense that needs to be dealt with. But again, there's a lot of just, I think, wisdom and a recognition of reality. This one always reminds me of those warnings that you see, like, on the side of the McDonald's cup. That came about because somebody poured hot coffee all over themselves and sued, right? I mean, almost every warning you could trace back to a lawsuit at some point. And this just seems to be that kind of thing where it has come forth from probably, centuries of Presbyterian wisdom of recognizing, hey, there are those who have these, personal attitudes and previous actions, et cetera. And so we need to be careful if we're going to receive an accusation from such a person.
Yeah, okay, so then 31:9, every voluntary prosecutor shall be previously warned that if he fail to show probable cause of the charges, he may himself be censured as a slanderer of the brethren. Listeners are going to note that I've brought this up several times now because we've hit the prosecutor point in different chapters. I mean, the principle here, though, is that if you bring up a charge against a guy, and you can't prove it, then you've been, they say, slander. You've been spouting things about this guy that aren't true, and so you may yourself be censured as a slanderer. Now, I'm curious, Steve. My question here would be for you: if he failed to show probable cause, he may himself be censured. Now, that doesn't say indicted or charged. It says censured. I'm assuming that you can't skip process for a guy like this. But so is the implication that he can be charged or indicted with a sin of some kind in relationship to his slander?
Yeah, that's the only thing I can see, is that, uh, the rest of the BCO is relative, or it's very clear, right? That censure is a very specific word that is used elsewhere, and it is the result of a trial. And so I think you would have to conduct some kind of trial. Now, the good news is that in theory, it would be relatively easy to do, right? Because all the witnesses are, I mean, the court are the witnesses. They're the ones who heard all the testimony, who heard what the prosecutor did and was unable to prove. And so I think in that sense, again, the process would be relatively simple, beyond the reality of, the time constraints that 32 presents on the process. It also may be potentially one of those places in our BCO where we assume highly technical language where it may not have originally been intended. I mean, the censure may be a sort of admonition type thing, although it doesn't use that word, it uses the word censure, rather than something that is necessarily the result of a trial. But I think the way our BCO is currently written and the way it is, interpreted certainly by the SJC, censure is a result of a trial, and you can't censure somebody without process. So,
yeah, this seems to be something that isn't always what happens. If somebody's found not guilty, then the person who's prosecuting is now put on trial. Right. This seems to be, was there a malicious spirit to it that was discovered? Was it found that he was faking evidence and things like that? Then it's like, okay, this needs to be dealt with, because generally, if you go into process and go to trial, the rest of the court said, I think there might be something here. So in some ways, the entire court, if everything was truthful, if everything was above board, the entire court thought there might have been something there. So,
yeah, and maybe there's another piece of this sort of behind it too, which again is the difference between the principle and the practice, where if I come, I'm going to pick on Jared again, but if I come and I want to lay charges down against Jared, and nobody, it's personal offense or whatever else. Well, I agree that in one sense, it's the court that has to agree to take them up. But I agree with what Jared just said, that there seems to be, you've met this burden of probable cause by the court taking it up. But if that was the case, then this paragraph is, almost meaningless, right? Because you would just say, well, obviously I met the burden of probable cause because the court took up the charges. And if we're talking about lying, like making up evidence or something, that doesn't seem to me to be probable cause. That seems to me to be, well, it's obviously a violation of the Ninth Commandment. It's an entirely different issue. And so I think that, again, I think just the way in which we tend to practice paragraph 9 is rather probably not going to be even able to be invoked in most circumstances. I can't think of a trial, maybe an SJC guy would know much better than me, but I can't even think of a trial where, especially at a presbytery level, where the court did not have to designate a prosecutor. Like, they didn't use the person that's making the accusations because the person making the accusations is going to be a witness, type of thing. So, I appreciate it. And I think it needs to be there. I think on one level, anytime, this is going to sound simple, but anytime you slander somebody, you are putting yourself at risk of being censured ultimately for slander. I mean, that seems axiomatic almost, but I think here where a prosecutor is pushing the issue and is, demanding that charges be taken up, and that it is adamant that he is going to be the voluntary prosecutor. He's not, and this is the other thing, sorry, voluntary prosecutor does not mean at the presbytery, the moderator says, we need a prosecutor, and says like, well, I'll do it if nobody else will. That's not what this is. Voluntary prosecutor is someone who comes and lays charges and is making accusations. So again, I think it's an important section. I just don't know practically how often it's going to be applicable.
Yeah, the guys at the presbytery meeting you described, they're willing prosecutors, maybe not voluntary
Right.
so much. Yeah.
And maybe not terribly willing prosecutors,
Yes.
but yeah, I mean,
That's right. That's right. Well, this is good. This is these many more sections are going faster than the first part of chapter 31.
we've got our legs underneath her.
Which is good or bad, I don't know.
Yeah.
I had a listener sent me a screenshot of the 55-minute episode we released at a certain point, and I don't know if that was meant to be a good screenshot or a bad screenshot. I don't know if they wanted 55 minutes or if they wanted less, but either way, we give an offer of all sorts of
Always
time limits.
leave them wanting more, not wishing we had stopped half an hour earlier. So.
We're all preachers, though. I mean, man. Anyway.
Was it Solomon Stoddard that was known to have said a 47th point?
Oh, man. I bet Ligon Duncan has said that at some point.
223rd.
Back in the day, he would... 3110. When a member of a church court is under process, all his official functions may be suspended at the court's discretion, but this shall never be done in the way of censure, and this requires a 2/3 majority. So obviously you can imagine that a situation like this would create some tension and some difficulty to present a fair trial. You want the guy to be well represented. Anyway, there's going to be conversations happening that he may not need to be a part of.
And this was recently amended. It used to just stop after there shouldn't be done as way of censure, but then recently was added 2/3 vote. I think originally they asked for 3/4. The overture did, but this is to say this shouldn't be done lightly. If this is something that needs to be done, it shouldn't just be a majority vote when they changed it. But the thought there too is that if this is a pastor, there are some things that a pastor might be tried for, and it doesn't result in him stepping down. It's a matter of some personal offense that doesn't touch to his qualifications, and they're just adjudicating that. Yeah. But there are things that he does need to be suspended. But if you do that, you're suspending him from his livelihood. So you need to be careful invoking this clause that it really needs to be necessary.
Well, and I think that's where that sort of great discretion needs to be exercised by the court, because in one sense, maybe what I would want to say is, does the nature of the offense directly impact his ability to, continue to minister to his congregation, or even to function as a ruling elder or a deacon? And on the one hand, you could say, well, every offense, impacts it, because he's supposed to be above reproach and all these other things, and I get that. But clear examples. I mean, somebody is accused of adultery. Yeah, I get that. He needs to be suspended. Let's make sure he either did or did not, and everything else. But again, I don't have the statistics in front of me or anything.
Maybe
but
accused of plagiarism, it's like, well, we need to. There's a weight on this, and it's a little bit gray, and so we don't need to do that there.
Well, and I'm curious, like, how often this has been invoked, especially at a presbytery level. I mean, is it more the rule or the norm rather than the exception that guys are suspended? And I think it goes back to something you said, Jared. I know it's impossible to know this prior to the trial, But if you were to sit there and say, if we found him guilty of this and he confessed, would we likely admonish him at the end of a trial? Well, if we would merely if it's a kind of sin, we probably would admonish him. Why on earth would we suspend him prior to it? And I do think two more quick things about this one. I do think it does tend to demonstrate a level of, for lack of a better word, sort of prejudgment on the part of either the presbytery, the judicial commission, or whatever else. And so that concerns me, but also that, now the middle phrase, it used to be the last phrase, shall not be done in a way of censure. And I was even thinking about this when we discussed this at the General Assembly a couple of years ago. I know it was adopted last year, but it was obviously, debated 2 years ago. I like to think of myself as a pretty smart guy. I don't know what that means, right? I mean, it's a negative, it's stated negatively, not positively. So in other words, what kind of suspension is it that isn't by way of censure? I understand that we're saying not by way of the censure that comes at the end of a trial, but a suspension from your duties or from, I guess you can't do the sacraments, but, from your official duties, that is a censure, right? It's one of the handful of censures we have. So if it isn't done by way of censure, I wish our BCO actually described not what it wasn't by, but what it is by. I guess that's one of my, I don't want to say frustrations, but I just think that there's a lack there. And obviously, Jared, you've described some of those in the sense of protecting the flock or whatever else, but the BCO just it leaves the court, with this wide path before them without any direction. And what they always do is they say, we are going to suspend you, but not by way of censure. So again, they define what it isn't, but not what it is.
I really wonder if it's looking back on it. So say somebody has a serious accusation and it deals with the safety of the flock, and they say, you're suspended until we figure this out. And they quickly find out that the charges were false. They were made up. They were, they were not true. And then when he's let back to his duties, there shouldn't be this, well, you were censored, hanging over him. So I think it's maybe a way to look back to say, if he's found not guilty, you should know that he's not, he doesn't have this cloud over him that he has been under church discipline because it didn't go through process. So it's a vindication in reverse if it's lifted.
Yeah.
In retrospect.
Maybe. Yeah. No, well, I mean, that would definitely be part of it, even if that's not what it's saying. I mean, I understand what you're saying. Mm-hmm. I'm just thinking like it shall never be done in the way of censure. Sort of suggests that it's not so much about how people are going to look at it later, but how it's actually being done at the time that it's done. And if by way of censure all you simply mean is, you don't utilize the language of the part of the BCO that talks about how to inflict censures, that seems not what it's saying. It's not the manner of. I think it is, or the manner of the infliction by saying special words or something. It seems to be much more kind of fundamental or foundational.
I think you're supposed to say abracadabra.
Yeah, exactly.
Case. Yeah.
But I think that's the other piece of this, that a lot of courts, well, I don't want to say they don't take this into account, because I don't know. I mean, but I would certainly hope that they would take this into account, because if it turns out that all of the accusations were false or unprovable, or even the testimony of the accused or his witnesses gives a context to the event that suggests that it wasn't actually sinful, or something along those lines, Well, you can't take back that time that he was suspended. You can't give that back to the man. Um, you think about like with an appeal suspends the censure unless there's a 2/3 vote, maybe even 3/4, but I know it's a supermajority vote to maintain the censure while an appeal is in process. But there is nothing you can do about this. I mean, other than hope that more than 1/3 of the court votes in your favor. Um, Now, I'm not suggesting we get rid of it. Don't get me wrong. I understand there are circumstances and offenses and accusations that would mean um, we need to have the possibility of protecting the flock. I guess I'm just going back again, even to Matthew 18 issues. I don't know. Again, I don't know what the percentages of the time this is invoked, but I would hope that it would be much more the exception than the rule, that pending a case, somebody would be suspended.
And especially if it's lifted, that there be some restoration on the part of the presbytery if he was garnished wages, or just sending somebody from the presbytery to say, hey, this was not true, and so we wanted to let you know he's been vindicated in this way.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing I would say too, that I think maybe this should be put in there, something like that if you're going to suspend a man from his duties, I'm not trying to wordsmith this right now, but something that requires a speedy trial, right? Because there's a time that you have to wait before you can institute or before you can go to the next step. But there's nothing really that suggests that you can't drag it out for weeks or months. Particularly if it's a presbytery that's doing the trial, and it's like, well, we'll get all of our ducks in a row, and when we meet again in 3 months, we'll conduct the trial. And oh, by the way, you're suspended. Like, there ought to be some sort of, like, if you're going to suspend a guy from his livelihood, I think a ruling elder is a little bit different circumstance because, theoretically he's not getting paid to be a ruling elder. And we're all a bunch of teaching elders talking about this, so maybe we need a ruling elder here for a good quorum. But I think that's part of that issue, is that, like, okay, it could be months before even you get to a point where you can make a decision on a case. So that's another aspect of it.
3111. In the discussion of all questions arising in his own case, the accused shall exercise the rights of defendant only, not of judge. A guy can't be a judge in his own case?
Well, yeah. I mean, it seems... I think part of this, though, is coming back to the severe difference between, civil, criminal, and ecclesiastical matters. That if I'm a member of a court, in one sense, you could make a Robert's Rules accusation that there's nothing that prevents me on voting from anything before the court. Now, we need a good parliamentarian. I only play one on TV. A really good parliamentarian who is, an official one, to say, well, no, the Robert's Rules has this, that, or the other thing. But if I'm a member of a court, then I'm gonna feel like I have an opportunity to vote or to act as a judge. And I think it's important just to clarify that when you're because actually it'll say the same thing later about the prosecutor, right? The prosecutor, even if he's a member of the court, once he becomes a prosecutor, he's not allowed to sit in judgment. So.
Well, what do you do if a guy refuses to step aside?
You mean don't count functionally? Yeah, you don't count his vote.
I just mean, if you've got a guy who's defending himself and he's an officer and he's belligerent, and so you just don't count his vote? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think you could do more than that. I mean, you could also look at him and say, all these things that you're doing right now are public general sins of failing to submit yourself to your brethren in the Lord, and an ordination vow to, accept and adopt the rules of discipline as part of the BCO. And it says clearly, you have no right, you're only a defendant. And if he persists in that, then you file new charges against. I mean, yeah. But, functionally, you don't count as vote. You know.
Well, what does Scott think? Oh, you better cut that. You can't say that.
Oh man, that's
Scott
horrible,
has no
Scott.
opinion.
I sure hope that didn't get recorded.
Yeah.
Well, at everyone's discretion, this podcast is over. Is that the right way to say that? Thanks for joining us. Come back next time to hear us work through BCO 32 with Fred Greco. Thanks to Steve again for being here. We appreciate your input always in your work to help us understand these very difficult and often simple things that I need a lot of help with. If you enjoyed the show, listeners, consider following us on Twitter and Facebook at Polity Matters. Be sure to subscribe in your podcast app of choice. You know that if you have questions or comments, you can contact us at politymattersfeedback@gmail.com. There's a link below to support our work, and you can find us, contact us in all these different ways. I don't know what I'm saying anymore. I'm a little delusional. It's been a long day. Thanks for listening. Until next time, say goodbye, gentlemen.
Goodbye, gentlemen.
Bye, gentlemen.
Y'all take care.